Welcome to Unit 2, everyone. We're starting with the cultures that will lead to ancient Greece. We'll begin in the Cycladic Islands. We're looking in particular at two important sculptures, woman from Syros and male harp player from Kiros. So in the Aegean Sea, we can see here on the map the extent of the cultures that we'll be studying. In this kind of pale blue color, you have the islands known as the Cyclades. So the Cycladic Islands are the islands that we're looking at first. The Minoan culture then rises here on the island of Crete, and the Mycenaean culture will actually have dominion over this entire area, but their base will be on mainland Greece. So again, we'll start with the Cyclades, with the Cycladic Islands. So most of the sculptures that we associate with the Cycladic culture fall into two main categories by gender, and the female characters or female statues collectively can be referred to as plank idols because they really are quite flat. If you see them from the profile view, they have very little dimension. Also, we know that they were, for the most part, painted rather elaborately, so the fact that they don't have facial features carved doesn't mean that they wouldn't have been represented with eyes and mouths, etc. It's also rather interesting to note that the female figures are nude. That's going to change quite a bit when we get to the full flowering of the Greek culture. But this is our first Cycladic sculpture to know, the woman from Syros. She's only 1.5 feet in height, so relatively small. You definitely can see some relationship between her and some of the works that we've already studied. Notice that the arms are held in really close to the body, although there is some removal, some negative space between the arm and the side of the body and a little bit of space in between the legs. But in general, the female sculptures do tend to have these kind of shield-like faces, somewhat up-tilted on necks that are more or less like columns, and then fairly boxy, square shoulders into arms that more often than not cross over the body. So they are very, very geometric. And of course, that is of a lot of interest to modernist abstract sculptors of the 20th century in particular. You can see kind of a common theme emerging here. You can see that there's a little more curvature in the way the legs are described with this particular piece, but very much in a kind of similar mode. If you look at the figures overall, they tend to not be overtly descriptive in the torso, although there's usually a suggestion, of course, of the breast. You sometimes see fingers, but most of the articulation of the body, the knees, the elbows, fingers, things of that nature tend to be kind of systematized and almost symbolic. So we do know these primarily from graves, but we also know that a lot of these pieces have been unearthed not by archaeologists or by art historians, and so we don't have as much accuracy in dating them, and we don't know exactly where each one is from or what the conditions of those burial sites would have been. This slide really gives you a good view of how the figures gained this nickname of plank idol, especially when you see the view on that far right-hand side. She's extraordinarily flat, but there is some angling in the body. As I said, the head is tilted somewhat upward onto the neck. There's an outward thrust somewhat in the upper section of the torso, a reverse angle into the buttocks. You see a little bit of a bend in the legs and a counter bend there in the feet. So it is almost like a very shallow W or a Z, kind of an accordion shape when you see them in profile. But you can imagine why these would be interesting to artists who were interested in abstract expression of the human body. Picasso would be an obvious case of an artist who was interested in that kind of abstraction of the human form through geometric shapes. You do get a little sense here of the painting that is missing from these objects. So there's very little articulation of the mouth or the eyes. The noses are pretty prominent, but we do know that they would have been painted. The female figures versus the male figures are kind of intriguing. You can really see the plank aspect of the figure on the left. She almost looks like a flat plank of wood in comparison to the way the male figures are rendered. The male bodies tend to have much rounder limbs, legs, torso, although the heads can still be somewhat flattened shapes. The men also tend to be somewhat more active than the female figures, and often the men are depicted in holding other objects. Quite frequently, those will be musical instruments, as in this example of the male with the flute. The one to know for the test is the harp player from Keros, and you can really see here the care that's been taken to try to reconstruct the sculpture from its broken pieces. You can see how much more damage there is to a body that is able to extend its arms and legs, the limbs, away from the torso, and especially if it is cut fully free from the surrounding block. So when you look at the artwork that we studied in ancient Egypt, and we think about those objects needing to be eternal so that the Ka could come to it, that explains in a very logical way why there would still be so much of the negative space of the stone in between the limbs not removed. As we move into the beginnings of Greek culture, you're going to see more and more of this freeing of the body from that marble block. And it does kind of animate things, make things feel more fully alive, more three-dimensional. Here's another male harp player. And then this kind of interesting example of Cycladic figures holding another figure aloft in the air. It starts to feel as if there's maybe some sort of sporting activity or gymnastic activity happening with these figures. They definitely feel a little bit more alive. They are certainly not as descriptive in their detail as what we just walked away from in ancient Egypt, but you can get a sense of where Greek art is going to come from when looking at these as source images. There are a variety of different types of the Cycladic figures. They've been classified into different types. You've got the most naturalistic type to the left. The elongated neck style is pretty interesting, almost feels a little like an alien on a really long neck. The figures that tend to have more of this very shallow space between the legs here are also a little bit more heavily indebted to that geometricizing effect that we saw earlier. But obviously, loosely, they all fit together into a very common body type, very common pose. And it is interesting that we have far more depictions of female bodies than we have of male bodies.